A few weeks ago, Sean McDowell interviewed Michael Kruger. Kruger is the author of a book about, quote unquote, the 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity, which is a very critical book on progressive Christianity. McDowell interviewed him in this video, Progressive Christianity, a Biblical Response. I'm going to be focusing on the first 5 or so minutes of the video that set up their discussion. After that, they just basically work through the 10 chapters, very short chapters of this booklet, really, that Kruger has written. And there's not much more there that I have to say, but I want to focus on the first 5 minutes because I think this is pretty significant stuff. Let's begin with the 20-second or so opener.
What are the key beliefs of progressive Christians? In fact, what are the top 10 ways that progressive Christianity compares and contrasts with historic Christianity or biblical Christianity? Well, my guest today, Dr. Michael Kruger, has written a fascinating short book you've got to pick up. It's called The 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity.
Okay, so this is just an introduction, and that's the book, The 10 Commandments of Progressive Christianity. Note how the way that this is framed, right? That these are 10 commandments immediately suggests authoritative declarations that are held by progressive Christians. Now, to some degree, that is marketing, right? That you just want to have a catchy title for your book. But it also is, I think, fundamentally deceptive, misleading marketing. I mean, even McDowell goes on and says, well, not everybody who's progressive is going to accept these things, but many people do. And that sort of underlies throughout their conversation, this deep vagueness about what they're actually talking about, what the actual target is. And frankly, they never really get out of that problem, which I think becomes a real issue when you're talking about progressive Christians, as they both do, as being something fundamentally opposed to the gospel. And yet you really never specify what exactly is this group that you're talking about. Who are these individuals? Name some names. We're going to see that that's a real problem throughout the video. Okay, I've now skipped ahead to 146 into the video, and we're going to watch here until about 3:10.
So you use at the beginning kind of J. Gresham Machen and what he wrote on liberal Christianity decades ago, last century, and compare that with progressive Christianity. Why do you compare and contrast the two?
Yeah, well, Machen's book is a classic, right? I tell my students, look, you got to read Christianity and liberalism before you get out of seminary because it's a great look at a contrast in two different systems, both claiming to be Christianity. But what Machen's point was is that what he called liberal Christianity is not really Christianity at all when you whittle it down. It's actually something that has the same language, but the core truths are taken out of it to make it more acceptable to the day he lived in. Now, what's crazy is that Machen was in the early 20th century, right?
Yeah.
We're talking like 1930s here. And so the fact is, in his day, he called it liberal Christianity. You could still use that terminology today, but really today we would call this progressive Christianity. The terminology is neither here nor there, but it's the same idea, which is people think they can reinvent the faith for each generation to make it palatable to the culture they're in. And what I wanted to put out in the book is that this is not that different than what Machen dealt with, and not that different than what even every generation deals with, where there's always an attempt to make Christianity more acceptable. And obviously we don't want it to be hindered by unnecessary roadblocks, but at the same time, we want to stick to the historic truths Christians had always believed.
Okay. So here's the way the conversation is set up. Kruger refers to J. Gresham Machen, his famous book, Christianity and Liberalism. I think it came out in about 1925, if memory serves. So right in the middle of the fundamentalist controversies, this is when Westminster Seminary, soon after this, split off from Princeton. And so there was a lot of dispute and debate about the nature of Christianity going on at the time. What Kruger then does is he adopts from Machen this very binary framework. You have Christianity on the one hand, and you have something that's not Christianity on the other hand, but pretends to be, masquerades as Christianity, and that's liberalism. Today, he says that's progressive Christianity. So he's already set up a binary framework here. And I think binary frameworks of this kind are dangerous and very unhelpful, because what they do is they lead you to think in black and white terms. You're either in or you're out. You're either on the Christian side or you're on the progressive Christian side, which is a false Christianity. And they're also one of the real dangers of this kind of binary framework and using it at the beginning to set up the entire conversation is that everybody who invokes that kind of framework is going to put them on the right side. I mean, this brings me back to the old, Bob Dylan's song "With God on Our Side," right, where he famously goes through the history of the West and how people have always put themselves on the side of God and truth when they've gone into battle against the other side. And what they do then is they blind themselves to the degree to which they are not aligned with God and not aligned with truth. And the danger of framing this whole debate and discussion in this dichotomous binary way is that Kruger says, well, we are the ones who are faithfully perpetuating the true gospel and passing it on to every generation. And those other guys that we're going to call progressive Christians, they've just completely corrupted it and lost it all. And it isn't the case. From 2 points. First of all, there's all sorts of truth to be found in the outgroup that you've defined as progressive Christians, but there's also many ways that quote unquote evangelicals have sold out, have lost the gospel. For example, there have been a spate of books published in recent years by several historians of writing about the late 20th century and how evangelicalism in North America in the late 20th century has been deeply impacted by the cancers of things like patriarchy and racism, and has deep historic links with patriarchy and with racism and with misogyny. And those are all examples where the church, the evangelical church, is failing to live up to or match Orthodox historic Christianity that is faithful to Christ. But if you think only in dichotomous terms, it's the other guys that are corrupting, then you're not only going to be blinded to the heresies and the errors and the maledictions and the heterodoxies or heteropraxis in your own community, but you're also not going to be able to appreciate the insights that come from the people you've deemed to be the outsiders. So again, this is deeply harmful way of framing the issue, and I think a highly contentious one. The next thing I want to note about what Kruger says here is he derisively describes progressive Christians as wanting to adapt the gospel or Christianity to make it, he uses the term, palatable. In fact, what systematic theology has always done is seek to translate and communicate the gospel effectively for every generation. So, for example, in the 13th century, Thomas Aquinas sought to translate Catholic high medieval Christianity into the terms of Aristotelianism, because Aristotelian philosophy in the 1200s was a major challenge to Christianity. And there were people who, I think understandably, saw that Aristotelianism appeared to be fundamentally incongruous with Christianity. For example, it seemed to deny the possibility of a person existing apart from the demise of their body in terms of the hylomorphic anthropology of Aristotelianism, or the view of God as a pure act creator who has nothing to do with creation seemed to be fundamentally incongruous with a Judeo-Christian view of God creating and then benevolently being involved within his creation. And so what Aquinas sought to do was to make Christianity palatable to people who were deeply imbued with an Aristotelian mindset. And he translated Christianity into Aristotelianism. This is what Christians a century or a millennium earlier than Aquinas sought to do with Platonism, with middle and late Platonism. They sought that same process of translation. That's what Christians in the 19th and 20th centuries sought to do with the rise of Darwinism and neo-Darwinism. And on now to the 21st century and the issues that we face in our own age. Every generation does this thing that Kruger derisively calls as trying to make it palatable. Now, he also does throw in a little caveat here, which is, well, of course, we do have to communicate the gospel to every generation. Well, then let's appreciate that that's what the progressive Christian is attempting to do with a self-reflection and intentionality. And so it's not a binary. It's not you, the evangelical, who is safely protecting the gospel, and the progressive Christian who is trying to corrupt and undermine the gospel, but rather you are all on a continuum attempting to translate the gospel into each generation, into the thought forms, into the cultural milieu, into the Wissenschaft of that generation. And so if you appreciate that, you can begin to break down the binary categories with which Kruger has set up the whole conversation. Okay, let's continue on. We're going to follow immediately on from where we just stopped.
So is it fair to cite Ecclesiastes that there's nothing new under the sun and say at its core, there's maybe some nuances, some particularities, but there's really nothing new about progressive Christianity the church hasn't dealt with before?
Yeah, it's actually kind of quite old. The term progressive is an oxymoron in that sense. It's kind of microwaved. It's kind of microwaved Christian liberalism for a new era. But when you peel back the layers, it's the same thing that Machen dealt with, and arguably the early church dealt with a lot of these same things. And so, every generation has to, unfortunately, go through the same battles over and over again. That's just the way the thing works. And what's helpful about church history is it gives you a big perspective that this isn't a new thing.
Okay, I agree with Kruger. This is not a new thing, but I would just like to rephrase it. Let's extricate that not a new thing from his tendentious binary framework that says, well, you have got the good guys who protect Christianity, and they're the evangelicals and their progenitors or their ancestors down through history. And then you've also got on the other side all those bad people, the progressives or the liberals, or who are just warmed over liberalism, microwave liberalism, I think was his term, and they're doing bad things. Instead of using that, the grid, I would suggest that there's nothing new under the sun, is that down from the very beginning of Christianity, Christians have been on the spectrum of trying to understand in each generation how to interpret and understand Christianity for every generation. There have been some Christians like Tertullian, writing at the beginning of the 3rd century, who said, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? In other words, saying that we should not try to meld or mix Greek philosophy with Christianity. It's wrong, in the same way that today you might think you shouldn't mix neo-Darwinism or a particular revisionist stance on same-sex relationships or something. On the other hand, you have people back to the early centuries of the church, let's say Justin Martyr or Origen or Clement, who were actively exploring how to meld Christianity or interpret Christianity, perhaps is a better way to put it, interpret Christianity through the thought forms of the day, let's say middle or late Platonism. Now, the great irony, I mentioned this quote from Tertullian just a moment ago, is that while Tertullian tended to disavow that in this famous statement, nonetheless, he himself was deeply impacted by Stoic philosophy. He was impacted by Greek philosophy. It reminds me of a quote from Fergus Kerr in his book, Theology After Wittgenstein, where he says, the theologian who says he needs no philosophy is simply doomed to repeat the philosophy of 30 years ago. In other words, you never get away from interpreting theology into the cultural thought forms of your day. You either do it with intentionality and awareness, or you simply have bought into certain cultural thought forms without knowing it. And this applies equally to the conservative evangelical. They are not free from this. So when, for example, when conservative evangelicals some of them have obsessed about trying to show that Genesis chapters 1 through 2 and other passages like Genesis 6 and 9 with the global flood, that this is scientific and consistent with contemporary scientific evidence, they are elevating science, contemporary modern science, to be the standard bearer by which the truths of Scripture are to be measured. And I would submit that that is capitulating in certain respects to culture, not from a liberal or progressive side, but from a very conservative side. Or when conservative evangelicals have focused upon the doctrine of biblical inerrancy, that in some of its expressions can reduce Scripture to simply a long list of inerrant or without error propositional statements, really a gross reductionism, I think, in terms of understanding what Scripture is, particularly if you appreciate the multiplicity and richness of different genre and things such as literary narrative, which is never reducible to propositions, then again, you can understand how Scripture is being conformed to a modernist angst about the establishing the truths of Scripture in a post-Enlightenment skeptical world. That too is an example, in this case, of conservatives being unduly impacted by and thus conforming to the patterns of this world. It doesn't just happen with progressives or liberals, it happens with conservatives and evangelicals too. So from my perspective, that's what I would want to stress is the real message here about there being nothing new under the sun.
That's important to know.
So when we talk about progressive Christianity, this is a term that can mean a lot of different people and a lot of different beliefs. There's some people who call themselves, or at least are called by others, as progressive Christians and seem to have an orthodox Christology.
That's right.
And there's others who've completely abandoned ship on sin, resurrection, deity of Jesus. So when you use this term progressive Christian, where did you get these 10 commandments from? And tell us a little bit more of what you're referring to.
I cannot emphasize enough the importance of what McDowell just said here. He says, well, there are progressive Christians out here who are Orthodox. Now, he only refers here to Christology for some reason. He refers to them having Orthodox Christology. But I take that to be aphoristic and to be just a general reference to, yeah, there are people who are progressives or who are called progressives by others who are Orthodox Christians. But there are others who are progressives and who are not Orthodox Christians. That's the essence of what he said here. But from there, they transition now for the rest of the interview, just as they had begun up to 4 minutes and 10 seconds in, and then now 4 minutes, 29 seconds onwards, they transition back to only talking about progressive Christianity, quote unquote, in a negative sense. Back to the binary, back to the dichotomy, that these are the bad people who are distorting Christianity. But McDowell just blew a hole in the side of that whole dichotomy by conceding that many progressives are fully Orthodox Christians. This is equivalent to beginning a conversation by saying evangelical Christianity is evil and false and on the wrong side of the dichotomy, and let's have a biblical response to evangelical Christianity. And then conceding into the interview, of course, there are evangelicals who are Orthodox. They're not all like Kenneth Copeland, for example. And then putting that huge disclaimer aside and now going back and talking about evangelical Christianity as if it is a negative monolith in a dichotomy that is opposed to progressive Christianity. That's exactly what they're doing here in reverse. They concede that there are fully Orthodox progressive Christians, and then they're just going to put that back on the shelf and talk about progressive Christianity as if it is this wholly negative, malevolent force opposed to Orthodox Christianity. Or as Kruger says, it's like microwaved liberalism. But they've just conceded that it is in fact not all microwaved liberalism. Okay, so now Kruger is going to introduce his book, and then I'll have a few comments about that.
Yeah, so this is a really important point you make, which is the term progressive gets lobbed around by all kinds of people. We want to make sure we don't use it frivolously or inaccurately. Some people, when they use the term progressive, it just means sort of modern Christians, right? Or even people who like maybe contemporary Christian worship rather than hymns only, they're considered progressive. Sure. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about progressive Christianity as a jettisoning, when you jettison sort of the core Christian historic truths. So the key word there is core. We're not talking about peripheral things, debatable matters. We're talking about historic, fundamental Christian doctrines.
Okay, so, again, so the problem here is Kruger says, yeah, there are progressive Christians who are Orthodox, but when we talk about progressive Christianity, we're talking about people who, quote unquote, jettison Orthodox Christianity. But that's like me saying, okay, there are Orthodox evangelical Christians, but when I use the term evangelical Christian, I'm going to use it just to refer to people who jettison Orthodox Christianity. I mean, this is just a completely indefensible use of language, and one that I think baldly serves to perpetuate obfuscation or confusion about how these different groups relate to one another, and indeed the fact that they exist on a spectrum rather than as two dichotomous binary opposites.
And so that's what I mean by progressive. And where I got the 10 Commandments is really concrete. I mentioned a moment ago, Richard Rohr had a devotional where he mentioned 10 things that every Christian should believe. Okay. If you don't know who Richard Rohr is, the audience, you know who he is, but the audience may not know. He's a sort of a Roman Catholic spiritualist of some sort, where
Just note the language that Kruger uses here about Richard Rohr. A Roman Catholic spiritualist of some sort. I find that to be very kind of dismissive language. It's not precise. And frankly, it says to me, it suggests certainly to me that Kruger hasn't invested a lot of time in understanding who Richard Rohr actually is. I don't think that Kruger he doesn't at least show evidence that he's given time to understand that Richard Rohr is a Franciscan, that he writes within a specific tradition of contemplative Catholicism, which is conversant with mystical elements, which has a central role for the Lectio Divina, or contemplative prayer and reflection upon Scripture, and it goes back centuries within the Roman Catholic Church. When he says to him, oh, he's just some sort of spiritual guy, it just doesn't show that he's giving serious consideration to the people that he is critiquing. And you need to do that. You need to invest as much time as you can understanding people sympathetically before you're going to offer critiques of them.
He's attracted a lot of attention in recent years. But what's notable is Richard Rohr got it from another guy, namely Philip Gulley, who wrote a book called, I forget the title exactly, but basically, if Christians were Christian, effectively is the sense of the book, which is here's 10 things every Christian should believe. I think it's maybe called The Church for Christian or something like that, where he lists out the 10 things every Christian should believe. And my 10 commandments of Christianity are literally word for word exactly what he said. So these aren't made up by me. These aren't pejoratively framed. These are literally pulled right from his book.
That's really helpful. So somebody could study all different people under the realm of progressive Christians and try to come up with commandments. What you've done is taken somebody who's one of the most influential, if not the most influential progressive Christian, and said, let's take his 10. So some people who fall in this category don't agree with one or two of these. So be it. We're just going to take it at its term and respond and contrast with historic Christian faith.
That's exactly right.
What Kruger has to do is avoid the challenge, the serious objection of cherry picking, and of engaging in a fallacy of a hasty generalization of saying, well, all progressive Christians hold these views. So what he does is he says, well, I took a person, Philip Gulley, who was cited by Richard Rohr in a devotional. Richard Rohr cited the 10 chapter titles of a Philip Gulley book in a devotional, and that's going to be what I'm going to call the 10 Commandments. Now, this raises an obvious question. First of all, it is quite clear that, progressive Christianity is a very diverse the term is very diverse or broad. It does, just like evangelical Christianity, it's a very broad term. It encompasses all sorts of people. It could be used to refer to people like John Shelby Spong, who I do think meet the definition of a classic liberal in the liberal tradition, all the way to somebody who I think is fully orthodox and really an evangelical, like Shane Claiborne or Ron Sider, the sort of left-wing evangelicals, as they've sometimes been called, or the red letter Christians, and all sorts of people in between. So the very prospect of suggesting that there is one list of 10 quote unquote commandments that describes all these people is just erroneous at the outset. It's similar. Another example of this is a website called progressivechristianity.org, which is run by John Shelby Spong acolytes, and it alleges these are the 8 beliefs of progressive Christians. Well, again, but it's absurd. But those 8 claims don't represent the views of all these people I just described. So you have to be very careful about broad brushing in this way. And yet that's what Kruger does by saying, well, these are the 10 commandments of progressive Christians. Although, McDowell says, well, of course, not all progressive Christians accept these, so they're not really 10 commandments. Well, then what are they? Now, the other thing here that I think is really concerning and revealing is that Kruger, again, he gets this from the fact that Richard Rohr cites in a devotional, he cites these chapter titles from a book by Philip Gulley. The first thing to know, if you look at Gulley's book, first thing is he doesn't call himself a progressive Christian in the book. He doesn't identify as such with progressive Christianity. He identifies as a Quaker. Now, I don't doubt or deny that some of the things he says are things that progressive Christians or many people who would call themselves that would I resonate with or identify with, but he's not like a representative of progressive Christianity as such. Note what McDowell says here, though. When Kruger says, yeah, I got this list from this book by this guy, Philip Gulley. Well, that's not very good, is it? I mean, that's not very adequate. It's like saying in reverse, well, I found this book by this guy. It has 10 chapters, so I'm going to say it's the 10 Commandments of Evangelicalism. And you'd be like, well, who is this guy? Right? Who is the person who has the authority and influence to be able to speak generally for evangelicals? Good luck with that. It's the same thing here. What justifies using this Philip Gulley book as a representation for what all evangelicals believe? And I think McDowell recognizes the problem here because he tries to address it. I'm going to stop sharing now the screen. He tries to address it by saying, okay, so this is one of the leaders of progressive Christianity, if not the leader. That's what McDowell says. And Kruger says, yeah, you're exactly right. Okay, that's an interesting claim. So Philip Gulley doesn't identify himself as a progressive Christian within the book, but now he is apparently the leader of progressive Christianity, if not at the very least one of the leaders of progressive Christianity. What is the evidence for that? Here's the interesting thing. The book, he forgot the title, Kruger forgot the title, and so I'm forgetting as well, but I'm not critiquing it, so I don't have to remember it. But this is it. The title is If the Church Were Christian, Rediscovering the Values of Jesus. If you look that book up on Amazon, you'll find it has 200 reviews on Amazon, which means it was a reasonably influential book, 200 reviews. That's nothing compared to the reviews of Brian McLaren books. Many Brian McLaren books have 300, 400, 500 reviews. If you go to Rob Bell books on Amazon, you can find books on average have like 1,000 to 2,000 reviews. Like Love Wins has over 2,000 reviews. If you go to Rachel Held Evans books on Amazon, her books have over 2,000 reviews, several of them. So her books, Rachel Held Evans books, have 10 times the number of reviews as this book by Philip Gulley. Now, counting reviews on Amazon, I'm not claiming is like one definitive way to identify impact. But I think there's no question that Brian McLaren, Rob Bell, and Rachel Held Evans, among others, have been much more impactful and influential among self-described progressive Christians than Philip Gulley. So it's simply false when Sean McDowell says, well, this is like the most influential person, or at least one of the most influential people among progressive Christians. I would say no, there's no evidence of that, which again, brings us back to the allegation or to the charge of cherry picking, that Kruger has simply arbitrarily selected this book for no real good reason, except it suited his purposes to say, these are now the 10 commandments of progressive Christians that we can criticize. All right, I think I'm going to conclude it there. So just to sum up, they begin the whole conversation by invoking a binary between the good guys and the bad guys, those who protect historic Christianity and those who undermine it, who are liberals or progressives. I've argued that that's a false and harmful dichotomy because it blinds you to the fact to the degree to which you, as one of the good guys, may in fact be conforming theology to culture. And it also fails to help you to understand the degree to which those outside your in-group may be indeed identifying legitimate theological insights that you should consider. That picture also fails to recognize that the real thing that is not new under the sun is that Christians have always existed on a spectrum from sort of standing apart from culture to engaging with culture as a way to become all things to all people, to use the language of Paul, but also maintain distinctiveness as salt and light. Each generation has to wrestle with this. And so that's the thing actually that is nothing new. The next thing we saw is that they concede while beginning and then later on reverting to the language of progressive Christianity as being all bad. Both Kruger and McDowell concede that in fact there are many progressive Christians who are Orthodox Christians. which completely undermines their justification for continuing to use the term progressive Christianity as a term to refer to those who, quote unquote, jettison Orthodox Christianity. And so I just find that this is a fundamentally unhelpful and indoctrinational, frankly. It's an indoctrinational framework in which now every time people encounter progressive Christians, they can say, oh, we know who you are, right? You're those people who capitulate to the culture, rather than the people like us who faithfully pass on the gospel for each new generation. That's not a helpful way to think theologically about the complexities of doing systematic theology and engaging with the culture around us. And the last thing, again, to conclude by way of recap, is that we saw that Kruger is fundamentally arbitrary in the way that he decides he's going to choose this one book and suggest that this is somehow broadly representative of progressive Christians, when in fact progressive Christianity itself is an enormously diverse category, just like evangelical Christianity. And just like you'd have to have really good justification to find one book that represents the views of all evangelical Christians, so you'd have to have very good evidence or justification for identifying one book that identifies or refers to all or represents all progressive Christians. And even if you could find that book, you might have better luck finding it among a book by Rachel Held Evans or Rob Bell or Brian McLaren, but you certainly are not going to find it by this relatively obscure, lesser known book by Philip Gulley.